Hello and welcome. This is your weekly fix. I'm Smita Nair. The idea that school history textbooks are an ideological playground is not a new one. But sometimes the distortions and deletions made to serve political purposes are so egregious, they're an assault on facts. Why are governments anxious to control what children read of their history? What impact does erasing inconvenient truths from history books have on children who are raised on this sort of occluded view of their history, particularly contemporary history? Who should be writing these textbooks? How should teachers approach complicated subjects such as historical injustices of race and caste? Recently, the Indian Express in a series of reports showed how the Modi government's syllabus rationalization exercise has resulted in entire portions related to the Gujarat riots, emergencies' impact on institutions, chapters on protests and social movements, including those spearheaded by the Narmada Bachao Andolan, Dalit Panthers, and Bharatiya Kisan Union, poems by Dalit movement and Naxal movement being dropped. There's also a move to restrict and modify how Mughal history is taught in our classrooms. The revision comes 2 months after excerpts of two of Fairz's poems were removed from Class 10's social science textbook curriculum for the 2020 to 23 curriculum of the CBSE. Joining us on the program today is Dr. R. Mahalakshmi, Professor, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Thank you for making the time, ma'am.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Right. Before we take a closer look at some of the specific alterations recently made in our school textbooks, may I ask you, Dr. Mahalakshmi, to address something that has had the right wing in India apoplectic for decades? Now, this is a sort of a long question with multiple parts, but there are overlapping elements, so I'm going to ask it in one go. There's been this narrative that an urgent course correction in school history textbooks is necessary because school history textbook writing has long been the preserve of Marxist academicians who've given Indic culture and the great achievements of ancient India the short shrift. This view, as you may also know, has sort of gained wide currency. Now, this charge is made in two parts. First has to do with Thomas Babington Macaulay, the one who introduced English as a medium of instruction in India. Our viewers would know he's seen as the architect of India's adoption of the modern sort of Western style education system. Macaulay's educational doctrine, it is said, was to supplant Indian ancient education and culture with a European one by belittling ancient Indian scientific knowledge, Indian traditions, and texts. Our right wing commentators say this made Indian receivers of English education ashamed of or exhibiting a certain disdain for Indian culture and apologetic about Hindu religion, and that we're still sort of dealing with this colonial overhang. I know it's a long question, but the second part of this is that under Nehru and Congress governments that followed, the charge they make is that leading historians made other distortions. That Indian indigenous achievement in different spheres were wiped out, and that the brutality of the Mughal rule continues to be understated in our books, and that Mughal rule itself was given more prominence at the cost of Hindu kings and rulers in the pages of our textbooks.
Yes, well, these are things that we've been hearing a lot about, and this whole issue of recalling of existing textbooks, of removing certain kinds of things. Let's first place this in perspective. So let me first address the issue of textbook revision from a broader perspective before I actually come to the questions that you've raised. Very, very important questions. Now, textbook review at regular intervals is something that all serious scholars belonging to any and every discipline would advocate. Now, they would stress the need to assess the academic aspects, whether newer ideas or issues or findings need to be incorporated. And at the pedagogical level, they would talk about how we need to balance content and learning outcomes. So, this is something that's happened across the world, and it's happened in the Indian context as well. Now, I found a very interesting essay by a professor of biology at an American institution called Jack Carter, where he talks about who determines textbook content. That's the title of his essay. And he says that there is need for up to date, well written, and quality science textbooks as powerful tools to change the lives of students and also to build an informed, thoughtful, and humane society. These are his words. He also argued that revision of school curriculum for all subjects is necessary, but it should not be undertaken just for the sake of easing content load. This is an argument that comes up very often. Or this should not be at the cost of the larger goal of pursuit of knowledge and a critical perspective being developed and inculcated. And this, in fact, such ideas, in fact, were behind textbook curriculum making in the Indian context from the 1950s and 60s. And that is when you have then the idea of the NCRT gets established in 1961, and the making of textbooks for the NCRT that comes up. And in between, in the 60s, you have the Kothari Commission that was set up, and they made some very important recommendations about the reach of education, but also about issues related to language policy and curriculum and so on. These were issues that were thrashed out in great detail by the members of this commission. They were placed before the public, and the suggestions were taken. So it's a very important document, the first major document to come up with a comprehensive plan on Indian education. Now, the NCRT textbooks that have really been the subject of much debate, these are textbooks that then take on the recommendations of the Kothari Commission. And for different subjects, different experts were called in. You had nodal committees that were formed, and then those committees gave the responsibility of writing the textbooks to others. In the discipline of history, you have stalwarts like R.S. Sharma, Satish Chandra, Bipin Chandra, and Romila Thapar, who were invited to write. They were already historians of great repute. They were invited to write textbooks for various classes for the NCRT curriculum. Now, let's look at the editorial board that actually commissions people like Romila Thapar and Bipin Chandra. What is this editorial board? It comprises of the biggest names in the world of history at that time. Tara Chand, he was the chairman of the committee. K.A. Neelakanta Shastri, the doyen of South Indian history, he was a part of this. Muhammad Habib, the great scholar on medieval India, he was a part of this. Bisheshwar Prasad, B.P. Saxena, P.C. Gupta, all of these people, well known scholars, established scholars who were a part of the editorial board, and they invite these historians to come and write the textbooks. Right? So, by no standard can any of these members of this editorial board be called Marxist in their orientation or scholarship. This is clearly a myth that has been propagated to legitimize what is a political agenda as far as textbook revision is concerned. And this political agenda is something that we find even in the 70s. Soon after the textbooks come out itself, there is an attack on the history textbooks of Thapar and Satish Chandra and Bipin Chandra. And the Janata Party led government, which came into power in 77, they actually, moved towards removing the textbooks of Thapar and Bipin Chandra. Huh? And again, let us also not forget that one of the constituents of this Janata government was the erstwhile Bharatiya Jan Sangh, the political arm of the RSS from the 50s till the time of the merger with the Janata Party. So even then, in the 70s, when there was an attack, it was by the Hindutva forces. They had a political agenda. They did not want to abide by the vision of the national movement or the constitutional pledge towards education. And that is why all NCRT textbooks have this, the constitution as the frame for the way in which they understand how what kind of content should go into textbooks.
Right.
Now, this kind of an attack then again happens in 2000 when the NDA government comes into power. So again, the political aspect, the political context is something that is unmistakable. And So what happened in the 2000s were new textbooks of a very poor academic standard were briefly introduced. The scholars who were involved had not really made any major contribution to the study of Indian history. And suddenly you have them given this enormous responsibility of writing textbooks for children at this very tender age from class 6 to 10, and then 11th and 12th, they would be reading these books, so very substandard books that actually came up. And of course these were then withdrawn, and new books were written. But today again we see the same kind of thing happening, and the difference here is that we have a very strong state led attack on the existing textbooks, on what is being taught, and how to change the goalpost, how to change the kind of direction in which, say, history of India is taught to people at the school as well as at the college and university levels. So we see from the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Education's report on textbook revision, the NEP itself. In all of these, we find that many of the issues that had been raised by the RSS or the RSS affiliated organizations,
Hmm.
including many that are in the field of education, that those kinds of agendas had actually straight been lifted and addressed, and without even sufficient attention that was paid to many of these issues. It was these criticisms of the existing textbooks, of the textbooks that were written in the late 60s and 70s, which continued to the 2000s, as well as those that were introduced from 2006 2007 onwards. The criticisms have just been accepted. Hmm? Now on the question of Macaulay, now, scholars like Mridula Mukherjee, Aditya Mukherjee, Sucheta Mahajan, they have written on this, and I borrow from them. Dinanath Batra, an RSS ideologue, he founded the Shiksha Bachao Andolan Samiti, and he was very active in protesting against certain kinds of ideas, certain authors, and so on. Dinanath Patra wrote this book called The Enemies of Indianization, The Children of Marx, Macaulay, and Madarsa. This was published in 2001, in which he articulated this line of thought, about how these are Macaulay's children, the leftist historians, and so on. And possibly these were already ideas that were current in RSS circles, but he actually comes out with this book, and there are many articles in this volume which then point out to all the errors that are there in the existing textbooks, all the portions where the sentiments of certain religious communities were being hurt, all of this being highlighted. Now, what is very interesting is the following. Macaulay's infamous minute of 1935 wanted to make the Indian like the British. This was because, in Macaulay's opinion, English education was not just superior in science, it would also inculcate superior morals. And so the taste, the opinions, the morals, the intellect, all of this would also be enhanced through this English education. Now, this is something that did not happen quite in the way Macaulay thought. After all, it was the Western educated Indians, as well as those who were steeped in Indian culture and knowledge systems, who spearheaded the national movement, right? Secondly, it is ironic that the British periodization of Indian history as Hindu and Muslim for the ancient and medieval periods, which is something that is current at the time that Macaulay is writing, that has actually been reiterated by the Hindutva forces, who are calling some set of historians as leftist historians and as the children of Macaulay. They are reiterating a colonial view of Indian history, where the ancient past is seen as a Hindu past and the medieval is seen as a Muslim one. And now this periodization has been roundly criticized. And in fact, it has been thrown out of the window long ago. The greatest strides in Indian history have been taken because of the efforts of those who strongly criticize the British and Western scholars who try to undermine the attainments of Indian civilization. D.D. Kosambi, a
This is,
mathematician.
sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Mahalakshmi. This is the James Mill sort of categorization of Hindu,
Absolutely, yes,
ancient
that's
India,
right. So
medieval
James
Muslim
Mill,
India,
the
and colonial.
utilitarian idea, that was also part of understanding how, what kind of systems needed to be put into place. But along with that, there was also this idea of what kind of history did the Indians have in the past, and so this kind of reiteration is something that historians, that scholars had very strongly criticized even before independence, but certainly from the 40s onwards, you have a very trenchant critique of such ideas. Now, I was mentioning Didi Kosambi, who is a mathematician and Sanskritist by training and a self taught historian. Now, what he does is, through a materialist interpretation of history, he talks about looking at certain kinds of processes. So, going beyond dynasties, going beyond wars and battles and dates, to look at the substance of history, to look at society, to look at economy, to look at polity in terms of administration, in terms of taxation structures, governance, and so on. So Kosambi really, brings that sense of that methodology into historical interpretation, and it is something that is here to stay, that has been taken forward by other scholars without necessarily others subscribing to the views of Kosambi. Now, Kosambi was one of those who always cautioned against using ideas that were incongruous with Indian realities, right? Although he himself brought in this idea of feudalism, and there's a big debate amongst historians, was there feudalism in India, and so on. Without going into that, what I'm saying is that you did have a questioning and a critique of Western ideas, even while some of the important and interesting methods and frameworks were being addressed by scholars in the Indian context as well. So, what we have in the 20th century is a history, a homegrown Indian history that is produced by scholars who delve into sources, who are critically engaging with earlier interpretations, who are contesting Western as well as some indigenous interpretations. They were not all on the same page. There is a variety of scholarship. Uh, and wherever something was not borne out by sources, there was an active debate and discussion and critique that was presented. So this is absolutely incorrect to say that all historians who are not of the Hindutva variety, they are all leftist and they are all Macaulay's children. It's really quite strange. So in a way, it's a joke to look at all scholars, all historians as who write in a critical way, who engage with their sources, whose findings do not fit into the agendas that the Hindutva forces would like us to have. That they all are leftists. This is really a joke, and we shouldn't give it so much importance. In a way, by going back and flagging it, I think we are giving credence to some extent, but it's also important to contest it in this manner. So I'm glad you asked this question. Now,
Yeah.
the diatribe against medieval history, that's the second part of your question,
Yes.
about how how certain periods have been given more importance, particularly the Mughal rule or Islamic invaders and so on. This links to what I was talking about in terms of how there had been attacks right from the beginning on the way in which the medieval period had to be presented, and it was very much a part of the RSS agenda in the 70s, and it continues to be so today. I think there is absolutely no grounds for talking of sanitizing or whitewashing of history, whether it is of the medieval period or any other period. Now, when we look at the medieval period, as I just said, it is about governance, about economic structures, about social groups, about communities, their lives, the lives of ordinary people. It is about art and architecture. It is about scientific and technological developments. What are the processes that allow for these? This is what we give importance to. So in that sense, it's not really about sultanate or Mughal periods. After all, in the medieval period, we have from the 8th to the 13th centuries in South India, a very, very different kind of structure. Again, in South India and in many parts of the Deccan, we have, rulers, dynasties that were ruling that were not under the Sultanate or the Mughals. So it's quite reductive to look at the medieval in this kind of a framework. And also, that even while we recognize this, we need to go beyond looking at the rulers and looking at actually what is happening during a certain time period. And here, we try to get as much information as we can from sources. Sometimes we do not have that kind of information, but we do try and corroborate, say, through archaeology, or through other such sources, through which then we try to build a holistic picture of a period, rather than just focusing on certain aspects like battles and who won which war, and so on.
Right. Allow me another question on, how Mughal rule is characterized in school textbooks. And the reason I ask you here is ask you the question is because it isn't just, the sort of the right wing in India, but there are some other commentators too who seem to suggest that, because there wasn't this unequivocal sort of condemnation in school history textbooks of the brutality of Mughal rule, that in some way, willy-nilly, secular historians may have strengthened the BJP and the Sangh Parivar's hand and allowed them to sort of weaponize this, the Hindu nationalists. I'm particularly referring to this author called Kapil Komireddy. I don't know whether you're familiar with your work, but I'll sort of read a brief extract from what he's written in Malevolent Republic. He is a critic of Mr. Modi and the BJP. So he sort of contends that secular historians, had they been more forthright about our violent past, it might have provoked a more sort of mature detachment from it. And allow me to read a passage from his book. He says, what he believes is the airbrushing of the pre colonial past was intended to deny ammunition to all those who cited the creation of Pakistan to intensify their clamor for a Hindu Rashtra. Historiographers tasked by the secular Congress establishment to clarify India's past, motivated by the desire to do good, caused immeasurable harm by blurring it. They applied recondite techniques and treatments to source material, ladled their prose with jargon, and lost in disciplinary sport, neglected the needs of the layperson outside of the priesthood. He is referring to historians. Students emerged from their exposure to this output without sort of an apprehension of their difficult past. Medieval India, despite all the evidence of its methodological disfigurement, was depicted in school books as an idyll where Muslims and Hindus coexisted in harmony, and this was only destroyed by the advent of British rule. This is what he writes. I wonder what you have to say about it.
uh, my first reaction is that this is quite a ridiculous position to take. History cannot focus on any one aspect. So, how do we construct a historical narrative? Let's first talk about that. We do this by looking at a region and the developments overall and placing the various aspects in perspective within a framework. At the school level in particular, we need to see how to prioritize information, because there's a lot of information for every period, for every region, as far as the Indian subcontinent is concerned. Let's not forget we are a subcontinent.
Yeah.
And so we need to prioritize the information, and at what level, what kind of inputs need to be given. So I do think that issues such as temple desecration or iconoclasm or imposition of religious taxes may be mentioned. but also equally patronage to different religions. Not just to one, but to different religions, where you do have instances of Muslim rulers who practice Islam, that is their faith, but who are also making donations to Hindu religious institutions, who are supporting the Jains. These are the kinds of things that we also need to mention. Equally important, we need to talk about the cultivation of the arts or the sciences and knowledge systems by these various rulers also. So where it is necessary for us to focus on the actions and the kinds of things that are done by kings and emperors, I think that we need to look at that also holistically. But I also think that we should not be looking only at the kings and the rulers. And there are very interesting ways in which, as historians, we have developed a methodology to look at these other aspects, at the social and economic aspects. For instance, when you look at Abul Fazl's great account of the reign of Akbar, we get so much more than only the figure of Akbar from that particular source. We get so much of information on society, on the religion, the festivities, the culture of the people, the language of the people, and so on. The court itself, court manners, court customs, the issues of writing, of patronage of Sanskrit scholars in the Mughal court. These are things that are very, very important also for us. Similarly, when we look at the court of a Chola ruler, or that of a Rashtrakuta king of an earlier period, when we look at the Gupta rulers, we do try to look at this from a holistic perspective rather than see them as belonging or being relevant only from one perspective. So I think that that would be my immediate response. I really don't think that this is a position that comes from from a historian who would know about the issues of historical methodology as well as the frameworks for presentation. So I do not agree with this position at all.
Okay. Dr. Mahalakshmi, if you could briefly look at contemporary history, its writing, and this also governments are sort of particularly engaged with, and which is the reason what prompted this conversation that we're having today.
Yeah.
My question to you is, what impact does it have on children who are being sort of raised on a diet of, if you remove large parts of what is recent history in your country, from your history textbooks, from your political science books, this sort of occluded view that kids are growing up with, what is the sort of impact it has on young minds?
Um, I think that this is a very, very important issue for us to think about. And something that comes to my mind is, when you see these tangas and the horse carriages, you'll often see that there is this flap that covers the horse's eyes, right? And the reason that is given for that is so that the horse can only look in front, it doesn't get distracted or diverted. And by removing what is uncomfortable or seen as inconvenient, we are doing precisely that. We are not encouraging children to think critically. We are not encouraging them to question. We are not encouraging them to reflect on India, Indian society, the heritage that we have, as well as certain kinds of practices that we have, which need critical examination. We need to talk about race, we need to talk about caste, we need to talk about gender, we need to talk about religion and the kind of descent that existed in earlier times. We need to talk about the way in which there have been episodes in history where those who raised their voices were severely put down. We also need to present to them that there are times in history when those who were brave and strong and were willing to sacrifice their lives, they actually brought about a change. So for many reasons, I think it is very important for us to present things. Of course, as I said, there are issues of pedagogy that are involved over here, and that's why educationists have to be very sensitive to this aspect, because at the school level, how much are you going to present is something we do need to think about. But I don't think we should withhold that kind of information. We shouldn't try to protect or think that, children are so innocent, we shouldn't present these kinds of ideas to them. I think it is important for us to present ideas, but also present them in perspective, not take the context out. If you take a context out, then you are presenting something that is distorted. That is what we need to contest. That is what we need to be wary of.
Right. Our viewers would be familiar with, if not, I would like to sort of inform you, because this sort of a battle, trenchant battle, if I may, on the issue of race and caste is playing out. US school boards and sort of parents have been involved in how the subject of race is being taught in both public and private schools, but particularly in private schools, in public schools, I beg your pardon. There is this concept of critical race theory that some sort of white politicians and parents believe is designed to make white students feel guilty for sins that they did not commit. And I sort of would possibly see similar arguments on caste play out if this were a point of debate. Now, Dr. Mahalakshmi, I know some textbooks, of course, deal with the subject of caste, but many school boards, state school boards in particular, sidestep the issue completely. I studied in the Maharashtra board here in Mumbai, and I don't remember reading very much about caste. So there is a certain um, reluctance to how this subject is taught in our classrooms. How would you say teachers should approach a subject such as caste?
Yeah, I think this is such an important issue, and I'm so glad that you've raised it. It is imperative for us, as not just educationists, but as parents, as part of this country, as part of this nation, to understand that we cannot keep information from people, even children, anymore. Everything is available to them at the click of a button. But we do need to be sensitive to the issues and devise ways of conveying such information, and also present these in an analytical way. To present the history of oppression or exclusion, for that matter, is not to rub salt in wounds or to create some kind of guilt complex, because the history of caste is one of oppression, it is one of exploitation, it is one of exclusion. Hmm? And today, when I read of ideologues talking about bringing Manusmriti into the curriculum and other such texts, it saddens me, because, of course, all thinkers, all prescriptive texts, like the Dharma Shastras and the other texts that we have, they have some very good elements in them, but they also have some very, what from today's perspective we would call regressive ideas. And the way in which, for instance, issues of caste or gender come up in a text like Manusmriti is very problematic. So it really saddens me to see people making these very loose kinds of comments. I think it is important, all the more important, for us to present the history of oppression or exclusion in the form of caste, and without creating any guilt complex. We need to sensitize children, we need to sensitize teachers as well. And this will really help us move towards that goal that our constitution makers had presented before us, an egalitarian and democratic society. Sadly, we are still far away from that. We still have atrocities that are being committed against Dalits, for such small things like drinking from a glass that is supposedly not meant for them, for riding on a horse during a marriage procession, for such ridiculous things. We have the lynching of Dalits, or those who are seen as not part of the elite sections, who alone have certain kinds of privileges, and who can dress and move around in certain ways. So I think in that sense, to achieve that goal of moving towards a more egalitarian and democratic society, it is absolutely important for us to be raising issues of caste and gender rather than to brush these under the carpet.
Right. If for those of you not sort of entirely familiar with where this talk of introducing Manusmriti in textbooks comes from, it's from Karnataka. The state's position paper on the national education policy has some rather problematic suggestions. One of the things it says is that the Pythagoras theorem is fake. So is Newton's apple story, and it advocates, as Dr. Mahalakshmi said, that ancient numerical systems and Manusmriti needs to be taught in schools. You'd imagine now that these position papers, which are suggestions that will build the national curriculum framework, are a result of robust critical inquiry, as our textbooks in the past have been. But you're wrong, because it appears that these ideas, at least in Karnataka, have been collated from Quora, the crowdsourced, unverified question and answer platform. This comes from Madan Gopal, the head of the state's NEB task force, was interviewed by Hindustan Times. This was only yesterday, and he told the reporter that he relied on discussions on Quora and some obscure paper he referred to from a foreign university. So that's the state of affairs as they stand. Right. Dr. Mahalakshmi, I appreciate you sharing your sort of insight into what has been a very contentious subject, particularly in the last sort of 8 years, I'd say. Thank you for your time as well.
Thank you so much for having me here.